Hey everyone, thank you for tuning in to Fantasy in the Real World, brought to you by Multiverse 2020 GEEK Fantasy Track. So we're going to be talking all about how fantasy and this world we live in intersect, and how the genre can be used for escapism or to deal with real world issues. So I am Travis Tippens. I am a blogger over at the Fantasy Inn, and I also host the Fantasy Inn podcast. But enough about me, I'm going to turn it over to our guest because that's who you're here to see. So I guess, Maurice, if you could introduce yourself first.
My name is Maurice Broaddus. I'm a middle school teacher. I'm also a writer. I write a horror, science fiction, fantasy. I've had about a dozen books out, nearly 100 short stories published. And I'm also the resident Afrofuturist at a grassroots organization called the Kepler Institute.
Fantastic. And John, if you could introduce yourself.
I'm John Hartness. I'm the founder and publisher of Falstaff Books and willing servant to Puck, our editor in Cat.
And last but not least, Aziza.
Hi, I am Aziza Sphinx. I am a techie by trade and writer by necessity. I've been writing professionally for about 20 plus years now. I'm the author of various paranormal, romance, urban fantasy novels, as well as a number of fairy tale retellings. And I am 100% Georgia Peach, born and raised.
Fantastic. And then before we get started, just for more information about all of our wonderful panelists, please check the linked videos from them in the description or on multiversecon.org, where you can also find links to all of our programming. And speaking of multiversecon.org, if you're watching this as part of the convention weekend stream, you can join us on the Discord channel for this track for a watch party of this panel with some of and hopefully all of our wonderful panelists. And instructions on how to get into our Discord can be found at multiversecon.org/Discord. So with that out of the way, I thought we could start off by just broadly addressing how do we think speculative fiction can provide a form of escapism from the real world? Because I think that's definitely at least one of the ways that people think of for how it relates to the real world. I guess, Maurice, if you want to pick up.
Sure. Although I don't know if it does.
Okay.
Because, actually, if I want to escape from the real world, I mean, my go-to is actually crime fiction. That's where I go to escape from everything and relax. When I look at my speculative fiction, it isn't an escape up from the real world. It's a commentary on the real world. And so I look at a speculative fiction then as a new lens that I get to view the real world through.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Aziza, do you have any thoughts on that?
For me, I think it's a combination of what Maurice has, but I think for me, I also like to explore the possibilities. So it touches on kind of some things that are being discovered from the science side, but melding that and manipulating it to a level that we haven't been able to quote unquote validate at this point, but to show that, this could be a possibility. So, being able to not just look at what's going on now, but to kind of dream about what's possible. For me, with my speculative fiction, it combines that those two ideas. So it kind of gives you the escape that you have the freedom and the opportunity to dream up any possibility, but also having the familiarity of, of seeing the same type of town structure or the same type of buildings or some things that are common to what you currently experience day to day.
Yeah, absolutely. And how about you, John?
Similar to Maurice, most of my speculative fiction has some type of lens through which I'm viewing the real world, but sometimes I can choose a work that I know already affirms my beliefs, and then I don't have to think so hard. If it's an author who I know I'm going to agree with them on any points that I know we sit in the same places on the political and social spectrum, so I don't have to be challenged there. I can choose someone that I already agree with and then I can enjoy the story. But I feel like when it's at its best, it's making us think about things.
Yeah, and I will say, at least for me, at least with my particular beliefs and everything, if I'm picking out an author who typically agrees with me, they probably are actually challenging a lot of the existing social structures of what's going on and addressing some real world issues. So I don't know, in a sense, it could be escapism, but it also could be kind of taking a hard look in the mirror at what's going on around us. Which kind of leads naturally into the next thing I wanted to discuss, is that fantasy has this ability to sort of take these real world issues and either look at them directly or frame them in a fantastical light, whether that's through magic or some other narrative device, to present topics to readers in a way that they might have difficulty grappling with if they're presented with them directly. So what do we think about that? It sounds like maybe at least Aziza and Maurice, you might be feeling similarly to this. I guess Aziza, if you want to take this.
Can you repeat that question for me?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a wordy one. So I guess basically opposite of escapism, fantasy has the ability to kind of take these real world issues and frame them in a different light so that you're kind of stepping outside of your existing preconceptions about the world around you and sort of looking at an issue in a new light. So whether that's through something fantastical like magic, or maybe it's not magic, maybe you're just like directly looking at it head on. So how do we feel that fantasy tackles those real world issues?
I've seen that, I think, a lot recently in some of the things that I've chosen, looking at it from a somewhat belief system. It's not necessarily always religious or spirituality aspect or that approach, but just the way people believe and process the world that they're seeing. And so looking at it specifically from a tangible approach, there are still situations, there are still scenarios, there are things that people still experience that they can't necessarily feel or touch. They experience and they kind of know that there's something more than what they can see with their actual senses. And so, you know, from that aspect, it does kind of put those things together. And I see a lot of works now that are starting to address real world, not issues, but trying to incorporate or explain in a different way these structures that we have become accustomed to as far as how we live day to day, and to pick them apart and see that if you approach them a different way, what are those potential outcomes? So you have that fantasy aspect as far as, again, that imagination and that ability to change your framework of a system that you currently see. But, you know, it's just a different way of looking at those things. And I think people now are starting to explore those and incorporate those into the fantasy.
So I'm gonna give a couple examples, one from my work and one from another person. Actually, I'll start there. I'll start with the other person's work, because the book that sprang to mind for me was actually N.K. Jemison's trilogy, her Broken Earth trilogy, and how you have magic as a stand-in for being able to talk about race and different elements of society, and then how groups of people end up having to navigate these really oppressive political systems. And I thought the story was a great commentary on all of that. And so you have magic standing in for that. And then from my own work, I think of my first trilogy, actually, the Knights of Breton Court, which was a retelling of the Arthurian legends, except set in modern day Indianapolis, where I live. And in that series, magic becomes the stand-in for homelessness. I tell the whole story through the eyes of homeless teenagers, and it was a way of interrogating the city through their eyes. And so Indianapolis looks very different when you're looking at it from how do homeless teenagers navigate the system, navigates the streets, navigate their day-to-day in order to survive. And I let magic become sort of like the symbol for homelessness in the course of that book. And so it was a way for me to discuss homelessness using magic as an allegory, although eventually I just go, and now we're just going to talk about homelessness. So, I mean, so eventually the allegory break down, I just go hit you over the head. But, it starts off, as allegory.
I think what Maurice just said is really key, because there are kind of two ways to look at it, either as allegory or direct commentary. One of the books that was seminal in changing my viewpoint on some things was the Magic's Pawn trilogy by Mercedes Lackey. It was the first fantasy novel that I read that showed a homosexual character as a protagonist and in a positive light, because I was reading this in the late 80s in rural South Carolina. These were not things that we talked about in positive light in rural South Carolina in 1989. So Lackey was very overt in she placed this character as her protagonist and went through a lot of the different things that he faced. But then, like others have mentioned, you've got the allegory of Jemison or Maurice's work, or I had a good one and I didn't write it down. And that's what happens when I don't make notes. So if you see me looking down, I'm not just petting the cat. I'm probably making a note so that I don't do this again. But there's tons of examples of using fantasy as allegory, and that allows you as a storyteller to kind of sneak in your education when you want to when you want to get your message across, but you feel like your audience may not be receptive. Oh, there we go. X-Men. I'm a comic book nerd.
Wait.
I grew up reading the X-Men. I was not smart enough as a child to understand that that was an allegory for racism. I didn't know, because X-Men had been running for a while when I was born. So they were well into the allegory by the time I found the comics. But if you are a kid and you see this cool looking purple fuzzy guy, and okay, well, he's awesome because he's one of the superheroes, but just because he looks different, these people are mean to him. Well, so you can sideways get in some of your education, and this is something that probably Maurice could speak on better than me because he writes more work for younger audiences. I'm not to be allowed or to write for or be around young people.
Yeah, so that's actually a really interesting point, talking about allegory and how that can kind of sneak in those messages sideways. And Maurice, I like how you mentioned N.K. Jemison's Broken Earth series, because I know now after that series, she's now kind of taking a little bit more of a direct approach and less allegorical. It's not set in a potentially fantastic world, it's set in like New York City, and you're getting like actual dealing with police and gentrification and like actual racism as we see it in today's world. So I guess sometimes it's, I'm sorry, go ahead.
She's through playing.
Right.
Yeah. And I think she's actually said before that part of the reason for that decision was because some people weren't getting the allegory. They weren't picking up on it. You had some people who maybe they're white supremacists, maybe there's something else hateful, and they're seeing themselves as the oppressed class when they're reading the Broken Earth series. So it's kind of hard to do that when you take away that allegory and you tell it straight. Right. So I guess my question to y'all would then be like, how do you know like how much allegory? When do you use it? When do you not use it? And how does that relate to the real world?
Sometimes you don't have to say it. Yeah. Sometimes it's either too important a topic, sometimes you're not writer enough to be allegorical. That's something I run into all the time. I'm pretty blunt because I'm not as talented as some of the folks that I'm sitting at this virtual table with. So I just hit you over the head with stuff. In a book that I'm releasing this month, Conspiracy Theory, I had to deal with the fact that I have 2 ongoing series where the secondary protagonist is a high-ranking member of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. So that's one of my heroes. And I have to then deal with the fact that the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department tear-gassed the crap out of some of my friends this year. So I had her quit. I just wrote, I wasn't allegorical at all. I wrote down a lot of what they did to my friends, and then I had my hero quit because of it. That was a time that I felt like I couldn't tell that as an allegory, either because I was too mad or because I'm just not skilled enough yet. I've only been at this for a decade or so. Catch me in 20 years and we'll see if I'm better at allegory or if I'm just still beating my head against the wall.
Yeah, for me, I'm direct, and some of that may be just based off of the nature of what I write. I'm a little more of the, I guess you could say, lighter stuff. For me, I see that or for me, it was less of seeing a balance. And so I think I started to write more to have the balance of the less of the serious and the more of the kind of fun stuff, even though a lot of the topics that I discuss in my works tend to be deeper. A lot of people don't get that, and I'm okay with that. Just because I write whatever my characters give me, so I'm kind of a slave to what they do. But it's, for the people who get it, they get it, and then they understand why a lot of people don't get it. But, dealing with the topic of death and how it is experienced with people, and taking the approach of people choosing when to die and how to die, and not necessarily in a suicide approach, but thinking in the terms of a death doula. And in that case, the whole idea and the whole subject matter is something serious, but there's no, prancing around it or what have you. It's kind of, this is what it is, but it is a choice. And so in making the choice, how a person experiences that whole process is extremely different, because they're choosing how they're going to go, instead of just being, tied down to a bed, or being in a situation where you're just wasting away and that's it. You can choose what that experience is going to be like. And that's kind of what I reflect in my fantasy.
Yeah, could you repeat the question for me real quick? I want to make sure I answer it.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it's relatively broad. So it's more of just like allegory, like, when does it break down? When do we need to be more direct? And then, like, when do we choose to use it?
Okay. So I've been thinking about my writing here lately, and the way I've been thinking of it is, I'm about as subtle as a Star Trek episode. I'm gonna make my point, and then I'm probably gonna beat you over the head with it. I mean, subtlety is just not what I do. And I'm thinking of 2 of my books in particular. Actually, my most recent 2. I'll take my most recent 2. So I have a middle grade detective novel called The Usual Suspects, and the protagonists are 2 young Black boys, and they are the like I said, it's their messy journey that forms the main thrust of the book. The allegory in place is the idea of the school to prison pipeline. That would be the allegory, such as it is. But in the day-to-day, tale of the, as the story goes, though, what are the students dealing with? They're dealing with, violence in their neighborhoods. They are dealing with authority control. They are dealing with what does it look like to navigate the world when the world has given you a label. And those are the very real things that they're dealing with in the course of the book. So, you know, the line between where allegory is and where I'm just, and the social commentary that I'm making, a pretty fine line there. And then with my other book, Pimp My Airship, now I'm talking a steampunk fantasy novel that yet still deals with the topics of gentrification, systematic racism, redlining, over-policing, and navigating oppressive systems. And in both cases, when all said and done, I've created basically the comments is like, wow, that was a fun romp through a bunch of deep topics. And that's what I wanted to do. My first goal is to tell a good story and to have characters that, you know, carry you on this journey. That's always my first goal. I know I'm not subtle, but I do want to weave a spell. So I just carry you along so that my non-subtlety isn't an issue. I'm not there to preach to you. I'm not there to, you know, I'm not there to proselytize, but I am there. I do have something I want to say, and I want to make sure you hear it. And it goes down a whole lot easier when it's funny, to be honest. So that's kind of the mindset that I use when I'm doing these topics. But no, I've just, if it's on my heart or it's in my community, I'm writing about it.
Yeah. So I noticed you said you write a middle grade novel. So I'm wondering, that kind of sparks a question for me. When we're talking about how we're relating these heavy real world issues to the reader, how much do we consider the target audience, whether that's the age group or something else? How does that affect how we're portraying our stories?
Well, I mean, it helps that I work with middle schoolers. And so I have this ongoing conversation with my editors, for example, where they're like, well, that conversation sounded a little bit too sophisticated. And I'm just like, yeah, you probably haven't hung out with middle schoolers lately. Like, okay, so like, I'm not kidding even a little bit. I'm last week, and I need to emphasize, this was not my idea, and in no way did Mr. Broadus prompt this interaction. I just want the record to clearly reflect this. But my students begin what they call Karen encounter drills, so that what to do in case they encounter a Karen. And I kid you, it was the most, I mean, to me, I mean, it was hilarious because there was a designated Karen, and she would, you know, stop and interrogate students, and they would have to come up with different ways to avoid the Karen or do some other stuff. And it was hilarious to watch. Sad another way, because, you know, these students are literally go, hey, you know, there's a type of racism that we're gonna have to learn how to navigate in the course of our lives. And here we are 12, that we've had to come to this conclusion. So it's funny on one level, sad on another. And then I just know full well, when I write this into a scene, into a book, my editor's gonna go, really, middle school students would do this? And I'm like, in some ways we underestimate our audience. And I want to go, whenever I write my books, I never want to underestimate my audience.
Yeah. And so especially if you have that like actual practical real world experience to know like exactly what your audience goes through on a day-to-day. So that kind of has me thinking as well, what is the difference in how we want to portray real world issues, whether allegorical or not, however we're addressing that, that are, say, either issues within our experience or outside of our experience? How do we approach handling that? I guess within our experience is an easier way to answer, but outside of our experience, if we're trying to portray something, how do we go about that?
I think I can answer more, at least for the end, you know, in my experience.
Okay.
Death is an issue death is a part of my long time life experience. From, you know, having premonitions as a 11-year-old of something happening to some of my friends, and it transitioning and actually those things coming to pass as I saw them. And so writing it from this perspective for me is therapeutic on my end, but it also, as I started to publish and I started to, you know, share that work with other people, I started to realize, you know, I'm not alone. And so while I tend to write towards people closer to my age, so I'm not writing for children. I don't have any kids. I really am not around kids. Like, so I don't even, I think, have that frame of reference because I was always an old soul. So I was always kind of an old child. So for me, I definitely know that my audience and people who I am initially targeting are people who, you know, have experienced death and who have, who don't want to deal with it the way that people are quote unquote supposed to deal with it. So they are, or have found that these traditional methods of grieving and dealing with that process, and again, choosing that if I'm diagnosed with a terminal illness, how I want my last days to be lived out. You know, people who are in that frame of mind, and for them to kind of be able to explore and have a little fun with it, to you know, have some lighthearted, something to escape from the, I mean, it's not really doom and gloom, because again, some people don't view death that way. I don't necessarily view death as doom and gloom. For me, it's the end of the cycle and the beginning of another. And so bringing that perspective into the world, it's something that, you know, people don't, a lot of times don't want to talk about. You know, it's, for a lot of people, death is the end, but for a lot of us, it's not. And so filling that niche and being able to show people that, you know, through fiction, through my fantasy, through the way that I write, that there's another approach to this, you know, that the whole planning for the end can be a fulfilling process, and not necessarily just, I'm just waiting on, you know, the line to go straight.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question one more time? I think I have an answer, but I want to make sure I'm answering the right question.
Yeah, sure. So I guess when we're trying to portray these real world issues, how is it different from like inside our experience or outside our experience? And if one of those speaks to you more, then just pick that and run with that.
Okay. Well, I approach all of my writing as writing the other, because, you know, once unless I'm writing about an insecure Black geek guy, I'm pretty much writing the other. And so so for me, it's always about how am I crafting these characters, these fully realized characters or fully realized situations. So and in some situations, I feel like an invited other, like this is a part of the community. I am a part of this community, but then sometimes I'm not part. I'm strictly just the other, and so that's kind of the balance I'm walking between in terms of your question there. So when I look at the Knights of Breton Court, for example. So at the time, I was working with homeless teenagers as a part of the ministry work I was doing. So, you know, so I had that experience with them, and you know, I lived in their world. I was had relationships there. So that half of the story, I was very comfortable writing. But part of the story also turns on dealing with gang members and drug dealers, and that is out of my bailiwick, we'll say. So then I have to go and research this. So then I end up spending a lot of time on drug corners and hanging out, observing drug deals, which might not. Well, my wife found out basically that I was going out and hanging out on these corners, and I would just go, look here, I get it. I hear the story out loud, and yes, that face all the time. But I'd be out there in the park with my clipboard and be like, oh yeah, no, go ahead with your deal, I'm good. And, you know, I'd take notes and everything because I wanted to make sure I was getting everything right. And then my wife did two things. One was she raised my insurance policy. And then secondly, she said, yeah, why don't you find different ways to research that doesn't involve you hanging out in we'll just say precarious situations. So, but I think that does point to the fact of, you know, I do want to research. I do want to get as much firsthand experience as possible because I want to make sure I'm getting the characters right. I want to make sure that the situations are right. And I want to be as true to what it is I'm trying to say as possible.
Maurice Broadus, ladies and gentlemen, the method actor of science fiction and fantasy. But to use that as my springboard, I come from a theater background. I have a theater degree. I did professional and community theater for decades before I ran out of time because I have books to write. I research characters that are either like or unlike me, the same way I created a character that I was going to portray on stage. I look at people who are like this. I talk to people who are like this. I try to find out what it's like to be this. And there's always going to be a piece of me, or a piece of what I want myself to be, or a piece of what I'm afraid I am in every character. So that will always allow it to ring true to some degree. And, you know, all of the things that everybody tells you on a writing panel: sensitivity readers, make sure your beta readers are a diverse group so that they can call you on your BS, all of that too. But from the process of creating it, you do your research, and you make sure that you try to imbue the character with something that's you. Because for me, that's how I can instinctively know how they will react in a situation, because this little piece of me is like the piece of the character that is in this situation. So that saves me from myself a lot.
Yeah, so kind of taking things in a slightly different direction, I wanted to talk about how fantasy, and really kind of fiction in general, or speculative fiction specifically, can consider alternatives to the real world. So say either that's a different system of government, different structure of morality, just totally different social structure from the bottom up. So it'd be cool to talk about how specifically your works approach that, if they do, or just how you feel the genre in general can approach that. I guess, Aziza, if you want to lead on this one.
All right, so with a couple of different sets of my works, and they are actually now overlapping, and I don't know how I feel about that, but my characters do what my characters do, and I just do what I'm told. So for me, the idea that I think I see in all of the works that I write, be it my vampire stories, be it my Wraith and my Reapers, or even sometimes with the fairy tale retellings, it is the idea of how things are created and how things are connected. And I think for some readers, it would be a new idea because of their lack of exposure to different cultures and their approach to how things are connected. I think there's this idea that kind of how things are created and how things are sustained and how things are connected, that for many people gets instilled in them through how they've grown up, but through the religious eye. And for my characters, especially my quote unquote race, it is really about the cycle of energy and the idea that, you know, regardless of what you do, there's a ripple effect. Everything is interconnected. Everything is connected one way or another. And you may not see it, but down the line, these things are going to touch and there's going to be a ripple effect. And it may not be linear, that their idea of even having multiple timelines, and when you're experiencing something, that whole deja vu moment, it could be that there are 100,000 or infinite number of timelines, and you just happen to hit a point where more than one timeline intersects. So they may be running parallel, but they're parallel in a wave, and every once in a while, one wave crosses another. So it is really the idea of energy and idea of connectedness that has been and is starting to follow through all of my stories. And, you know, that is kind of, I think, my place in the expression of fantasy is to explore this particular idea and to show in my works how this idea, again, can potentially unfold.
Yeah, I'd like to jump off of something Aziza said at the beginning, which is about having giving space to dream. And so, so my next project, I've just started writing my next trilogy, and it's actually a space opera, and it was pitched as Black Panther meets The Expanse. And there's a lot of world building that's going into this book, and so I've probably spent about a year and a half world building for it, right? And so I had mentioned I'm the resident Afrofuturist at my community organization, and so the Kepler Institute, we do a lot of it's a grassroots organization. We train up young leaders to address problems in the community, and so. But I basically kind of pose the question: what are we building towards? You know, what is the future that we want to see? Like, what if tomorrow we win? What does that look like? If we could rebuild a government, if we could rebuild various institutions like education or develop our own economic system, what could that look like? And it's been an interesting series of conversations we've had over the last year and a half. And so so I'm doing this world building, and like I said, I'm literally thinking through, or I've thought through, because I've already written book one now. But what does it look like for this intergalactic kingdom to govern themselves? What sort of leadership structure do they have? Because we get to reimagine it. We get to reimagine leadership. We're not stuck in this current mold. We can reimagine anything we want. So create a new leadership structure, create a new policing structure that if we have a society that values culture and values art and values relationship, well, you know what? Policing looks differently in that environment, or it's eliminated entirely. I get to rethink this entire structure. What does education look like if we're not so stuck to this whole school to prison pipeline type model that we have that warehouses kids more than educates them? If we could redo education, wait, we can do that too. And then reimagine an economic system that prioritizes humanness and relationships and create social customs around that again prioritize how we relate to one another over everything else as our economic model. All right, this is the world I'm trying to build this, and so it creates sort of this feedback loop. It's like, so as a storyteller, I'm casting visions for what these worlds could look like, and what our work could work towards, that sort of thing. And then once we have these sort of visions of what we could be like, then it loops back into the work of, all right, so how do we start creating that future in our present? What does it look like to take steps towards that now? And I think that is the true power of speculative fiction, of fantasy, of science fiction. We get to create these worlds, and then we can use that as roadmaps to sort of guide us through, help us navigate our present and work towards the future. And I think it all comes back to, we are professional daydreamers. We dream, and we don't often take the time to, or space as individuals or as collectives, to just dream about the possibilities of what could be. So there you go.
I gotta follow that. Maurice, it's a good thing I like you. So in most of my work to date, there has been very little of reimagining governmental systems, because I write urban fantasy set in our world. I reimagine physics and magic, and I reimagine those things. I'm working on some things moving forward where, like Maurice, I'm having to create a lot more than I've ever had to do before. I've never had to create continents out of whole cloth and then figure out who runs them. What are people like there? What is the temperature like there? World building's hard, man. I understand why epic fantasy books are so thick now. If you spend all that time world building, you want to write something with heft after when you're done. But it does give you that freedom, which the danger to that for a writer, and what happens to a lot of new and aspiring writers is they spend all their time world building and then they don't write the book. When I talk to young writers and I talk to unpublished writers, I give them this piece, this little tidbit. World building is like your underwear. It needs to be there to keep everything in the right place, but I don't need to see it. I don't have any idea how many bathrooms there were on the USS Enterprise. And I bet until they came up with the book that was the schematic of the Enterprise, neither did anyone else, because it didn't matter. As I'm going through and I'm writing a high fantasy piece right now, I'm like, oh, I need another town name. Okay, let's take a couple of minutes. It's this town, it's this climate, it's on this continent. Okay, anything else I can fill in later. And then later on, once I've puked up a first draft, I'll have to go back through and make all of the pieces fit better and make sure that all of my systems of government aren't so conflicting that everyone will be in constant war, because that's not this book. But that's really, it's powerful, it's freeing, it's terrifying, it's all of those things to be able to reimagine every piece of the world. And it's a lot of work to do it well. That's why I write books that are set in my hometown and that are set in the real world. My world building is Google Maps most days.
Yeah, I think that's interesting that it sounds like between the three of you, you write a kind of broad variety of stories, a broad variety of settings, broad variety of just time periods that they're set in. So something that kind of goes hand in hand with imagining something different, an alternative to the real world, whether you're looking really far into the future or where we are right now. I guess, what do we hope that readers take away from that in terms of like thoughts that they can carry forward, whether they're actionable thoughts, whether they're just alternative ways of thinking about the world? Do we want them to just have the idea that, oh, something else is possible? Or do we want them to have that roadmap, like Maurice was saying, where like they have an idea on what steps can be taken next?
I'm the idea person. You can go ahead, John, but I'm just letting y'all know I'm the idea person.
For me, it depends on the book. Because what I'm currently producing are books in series, each book in an arc is going to have a different answer to that question. The first piece of an arc is going to raise a question. The second piece of an arc is hopefully going to provide some of that roadmap. And then usually the climactic piece of the arc, if I'm doing a trilogy, is going to provide closure and hope and that kind of thing. That's the way I tend to structure my series. So yes, you can do all of that, and you can do it all in one book. You can do all of those things with different pieces of different ideas. I can't fix the structure of policing in the modern world. Obviously, no one else can either yet. But I can point out some of the problems, and that can be one piece of the book. And then in the other piece of the book, I can show how characters have grown past some of their initial preconceptions about each other, and they can provide hope for readers for, okay, well, this idiot figured it out, so maybe my idiot uncle that I yell at every Thanksgiving can figure it out. So you can do all of those things in different books. You can do them all in one book, a little here, a little there, or not at all.
Yeah, I'm very much, I just want to spark the idea. Here's a different perspective that apparently we don't have enough people yelling or enough people being loud enough to say, hey, here's another opportunity, here's another idea. So I'm putting it in writing, and I'm sliding it out that way. And for those that are meant to receive it, they'll see it, and then hopefully it'll be enough to get together so that the voice becomes louder. It's one of the things that I said it, you're not hearing me, so let me do it this way. So maybe I get 100 people to say it, and maybe you'll actually listen instead of me being the mouse in the lion's den when everybody's roaring. So, and a lot of the things that I think write about are things that have existed in the past. It's the pieces that melded us together that have been forgotten or intentionally removed so that it keeps people divided. And so I'm just kind of bringing back up, hey, this really existed before, and things were, as far as community, and the idea that if I posted this the other day, you can try to fight your enemy all you want, but what happens when the enemy would rather destroy you and themselves and your entire world than to give you an equal playing field? So you're doing all of this, but ultimately they would rather destroy all that is, including themselves, than to give in. And so it's having that idea and understanding that even if you fight this battle, you can fight this battle, we could all be gone. The earth may be here. It will in some way, form, or fashion, even if we destroy it as we know it. We look at these cities where people have had to leave, these mining towns, these places that are abandoned, and nature takes back over. So even when we're all gone, generations later on, or even if everything gets wiped out right now, nature finds a way. And keeping that idea that while you're doing all of these fightings, this is still a possibility, but you can try to mitigate that by doing these other things. But again, getting enough people to hear the idea so that it can come from, it can be resurrected from beneath and flourish, so that it may actually be implemented in a way that is beneficial to all.
So it's about the takeaway that I want to leave to the reader, if I understand the question right.
Yeah.
Okay, and I guess my takeaway points are always, I guess it kind of springboards. Yeah, depends on the book. And so I look at Pimp My Airship, for example, the steampunk novel. Well, it started with me meditating on the question, I'm just a writer. How can I use my gifts to leverage change in my community? I mean, that was my starting point. And so the novel, kind of plays out that idea. First you have to become woken up to what's going on in your world around you, and then find the opportunities where you can to leverage your gifts and talents to start making changes where you are with what you have. And so that, I hope, is the takeaway that the reader gets, which is, hey, you know what? We all have a voice. We can all add to the chorus of change. Now, but then, and it's funny you asked that question, because like with The Usual Suspects, that was always the question my editor kept asking me. All right, so what is your takeaway point with the readers? And I'm just like, I'm not sure. Middle school journeys are messy. I mean, these kids, don't expect a clean ending. They're just trying to work it out. And she just kept coming back like, I know, but what is the one thing you want to leave the reader with? And so I had to think through that a lot, because it's just like, all right, well, in the end, I mean, you have these kids who teachers and allegorically society has already given up on. I mean, because students, there are certain students who get written off early on as troublemakers. And then this book basically stars those kind of students. And so what does it look like for, all right, so yeah, society's written you off, but you don't have to listen to what society has labeled you. You don't have to live into that label. So what does it look like for you to maintain your agency and solve your problems? And I was like, even if that journey is messy. And so that is what I hope the takeaway is from that book. So like I said, it depends on the book. So.
Yeah, and so all good points from all three of you, and we've kind of danced around this, touched on it a little bit already, but another question I have is less what do we want the impact to be on the readers of our stories, and more in just gesturing vaguely at the state of the world at the moment. Sometimes I've talked with writers before who feel like, why bother? What's the point of writing something fantastical at the moment when the world is what it is? So how do we reconcile the importance of stories in a time when the world around us seems to be hectic? John, you want to take that first?
I can't fix everyone. But if I can help one person, either I help them deal with something that is in their life, or I help them see something in a different light. I want to make my world a better place, one reader at a time. I can't reach 300 million Americans at one time. I don't think anyone can reach 300 million Americans at one time today. But I can reach thousands of people with my work. And by writing things that resonate with me, I will find people out there that those words will resonate with, and hopefully and I know the impact that fantasy literature can have on someone's worldview, because I know that somewhere out there's a high school kid thinking, well, this is how the world is. This is how these people are. And then maybe they can read a fantasy book and not even know that there's supposed to be a point there. But then the next time they run into somebody, they recognize a similarity from a character that they liked in a book to somebody in the real world. And then all of a sudden, it chips away at the xenophobia that's being built by showing more different things. And I know that I've seen fantasy literature do it for me, do it for other people. So that's what I'm trying to do. And I'll take one person per book if it's all I get.
I'm with John on that one. That's first and foremost, I think, well, first and foremost, I know I write for my own sanity. Again, I'm an empath and I channel my character. So most of the time, whenever I write, I have absolutely no recollection. I have no idea what ends up on the page until after the fact. So it is for my sanity. But that message, the very fact that this is a way to maintain some level of sanity, kind of, I think, is the point of my fantasy. And the fact that, when people start asking, well, how do you get in this? You have to understand that, again, this is a way to work through some of those things. Some people, work through this that they're seeing, the things that they're seeing in the world, the stress that they're dealing with every day. That fantasy is an outlet. And again, like John said, it's a matter of one person at a time. It starts with me. And again, as a way for me to work through things, but also acknowledging and understanding that there are other people out there who are going through the same things, and have been handed a traditional way of handling this and it's not working for them, the ability to then write fantasy would be a way to maybe for them to work through, to be able to see it in a different way and imagine a different outcome and imagine a different approach to deal with whatever stress or whatever issue that they're dealing with. And they can see it now on the page, and it's kind of removed in the sense if they've created some character, but they may not even realize that they have these other options until they see their character approaching it and experiencing what they're experiencing in a different way.
Yeah, no, I definitely, yes to all of that. Because I often say, you know what, I write for me. When all said and done, I write for me. If someone said, hey, why bother writing? I'm like, do you know how much I've written during these pandemics? Do you know how much I've written? And why is that? Because writing for me is processing the world around me. You know, I used to say that, you know, when I came up as a horror writer, because, you know, 20 years ago, I was a horror writer. And part of that was, you know what, I am processing my rage. I'm processing my rage of, you know, the injustice I see around me. I'm processing the rage of the evil that I see carried on. I'm processing my rage from a history and legacy of violence inflicted against my people. So, you know, horror for me was a great way for me to process all of that. And I wrote a lot of horror. So at the beginning of the summer, I was doing, you know, so all of a sudden, oddly enough, I am back to writing horror this year by strange coincidence. But I also am wrestling with my hope. And so what is my future hope? And so with, you know, now I say that, you know, as an Afrofuturist or a futurist, yeah, as an Afrofuturist, you know, I'm still pointing towards something. I'm still working towards something, even if it's just in my own heart. As like, there's got to be a better world, and we've got to be able to create a better future. And I need to start writing about that future now, if only to help me stay sane and to help ground me so that when I wake up in the morning, I can get back to work, working towards that future. So writing for me, let me stay sane and then get back to the work.
Okay, and I know we are coming up on time, but I do want to, before we close out, go around and give you each briefly 10, 15 seconds, just where can people find you and your latest work? I guess, Maurice, if you want to start.
Yeah, I have a novelette up on Beneath Ceaseless Skies. If you want a taste of my science and my fantasy and science fiction, I have a novelette, Bound by Sorrow, up there. I'm also the editor one of the editors at Apex Magazine. And my next book out will be another middle grade called Unfadable, coming out in the spring.
All right, Aziza.
Probably the best place to find me will be starting at my website. I've got bits and pieces, snippets, little character information. The website is www.azizasphinx.com. And I'm sure they're posting up what it's going to look like, how to spell it and everything. So start at my website, and all of my books are available at wherever books are sold. I actually do have a book release on Halloween, my next vampire novel, A Licentious Storm.
You can find my work and the work of multiple other multiverse guests at falstaffbooks.com. You can join us on Facebook in our Facebook group called The Misfit Toys. I also have a Facebook group just for my work, and my most recent release is Conspiracy Theory. It's book number 7 in the Quincy Harker Demon Hunter series, and it came out this week. So,
all right.
That's in the future. Future.
Well, one last thing before we go. We are collecting for our charity at ko-fi.com/MultiverseCon, and all donations, less fees, will go to support the Equal Justice Initiative. And finally, if you want some multiverse swag, check out the store on our website. We have shirts, enamel pins, and more. And if you enjoyed this panel, please be sure to check out Multiverse's other programming this weekend. Our full schedule is available on multiverse.org. John, Aziza, Maurice, thank you so much for this panel. This has been wonderful. You have some brilliant insights. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the con.
All right. Thanks for having us.
Thank y'all.
Great.